So today we will be connecting the dots and looking at what all this means in terms of where we are going from here, both as a nation here in the United States and the whole world is going, because the message of Fatima is is a universal message. It pertains to all peoples. Our Lady is bringing about near peace, which we are already now living in at this time, and she is the Queen of Heaven and Earth, and that means that things are going to happen according to the way she wants them to happen. Now, keeping that in mind, we have to remember from the Gospel where Our Lady tells the servants at the wedding feast at Cana to do everything that her Son, which is Jesus Christ, says to do. So, in other words, it's the fulfillment of God's will in the world. So, I've just gotten done watching the latest video from Roger Stone regarding the JFK assassination and the release of the files that was authorized by our President Donald Trump, which shed some new light on what we already knew, that Kennedy was assassinated by powerful forces within our own government, as well as foreign operatives. And we pretty well know now who actually pulled the trigger that killed Kennedy. There were actually at least two shots that struck President Kennedy, one from the under the bridge there from the front, which went through his neck. About this point, we know that that was the opening wound in the coroner's investigation originally, which was covered up by our own government after they illegally took the body of President Kennedy at gunpoint, and along with President LBJ, took him back to Washington, D.C., that is the corpse, where they did basically destroy all the evidence as to what really happened. So the other entry wound was from the back of the head, and now this was basically this fact was obfuscated by the Warren Commission, particularly Gerald Ford, who crossed out that fact from the autopsy and made it appear to be from the lower neck area, which would then, it was portrayed as being not an exit wound but an entry wound for the first bullet, which in fact is just the reverse of what happened. The first bullet struck Kennedy in the front of the neck and went all the way back there. So now we're looking at two shots that had struck President John F. Kennedy. So we know there had to be at least two assassins, because one shooter could not have both fired the shot that struck Kennedy in the neck and then at the same time struck Kennedy with the shot in the back of the head. So we know there was at least two assassins there. Now, okay, so that was the beginning of this process. It was actually a coup d'etat to take out the democratically elected president, who was about to take our troops out of Vietnam. He was going to take steps to do away with the Federal Reserve System and install gold-backed currency, he was going to do a lot of other things that displeased some people who were upset by the way things were going. Like, particularly, he objected to using unethical means to assassinate Castro or to cause a confrontation with Cuba at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We also know that in appointing his brother Bobby Kennedy, he caused a lot of confrontation with organized crime figures, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, Las Vegas. And he was mixed up with organized crime as well as, of course, his father had been before that. But this led to Kennedy's being involved with certain women, Judith Exner, Judith Campbell Exner, and Marilyn Monroe, and various others, which were set up essentially by the mafia. So there may have been blackmail as well there. Very likely they had damaging information regarding these certain relationships of President Kennedy at that time, even before he became president, which would have been harmful in his re-election. So actually, the main figure we now know that caused the assassination of President Kennedy was LBJ, a very crooked scoundrel. All he cared about was his own image and his own power. You see, he was obsessed with power. So it was all this ambition for him to become president. He thought this was the only opportunity. He didn't want to be vice president, but he thought maybe there was a chance, just possibly, if he became vice president, that he could become president, and that's why he got on the ticket with John Kennedy in 1960. So, and then of course he knew that he was going to lose because he, basically took us further into war in Vietnam, which was extremely unpopular at that time. Kennedy would have taken us out of Vietnam. So he was basically going along with this corrupt elite establishment who were going against the interest of the American people. You see, we now know, if you look back into the writings of the Greek philosophers, particularly Plato, in the Republic, he writes about the different stages that occur. And the next level after a democratic form of government is, things go down the hill because people use it for their own gain, their own personal gain, without thinking of the common good. So you see, even Tocqueville understood that there had to be religion, particularly. He was thinking in terms of the Catholic Church, of course, in America, because he had traveled to America. And without that, you're going to have a slow decline into tyranny. So that's where we are today. It doesn't seem that it's going to change. It's going to probably continue to go in that direction. But the offsetting figure, of course, is something miraculous that happened in 1917 when Our Lady appeared to three shepherd children in Portugal and gave them certain instructions as to what we have to do as Christians to lead to a different solution. In other words, the world could go down very quickly if we get into more kinds of warfare, particularly Russia. So Our Lady said, no, Russia is going to be converted, and this will bring about a era of peace, but it only will happen if certain conditions are met. So you see, there were actually millions of Christians throughout the world who were praying over this period, over this 100-year period, particularly praying the Rosary and making consecrations and commitments to change their lives, to observe reverence for our Lord Jesus and Our Lady on the first Saturdays of each month over a period of time within a year. So all these things, these requirements or prerequisites have been met. We know that because the Pope did release the secret of Fatima. So now it's 100 years later, and these prophecies are already occurring now, taking place in fulfillment. So we have at this time an air of peace. So there are certain things which are antithetical with an air of peace. We can't have widespread corruption. We can't have lies. We can't have deception in government. We can't have our nation subservient to a terrorist state, which projects terrorism for the benefit of certain few individuals within that terrorist state who claim to be racially or superior to everybody else. That doesn't coexist with an air of peace. We can't have abortion. We can't have pornography. We can't have a widespread mentality of contraception. We can't have euthanasia, the killing of disabled people, of elderly people, just because they are not doing anything that the elite consider to be useful work. You see, in other words, the air of peace is premised on justice. It has to be premised on justice for everybody, not just for these few elites who control the levers of government or power, or a shadow government type thing where they use terror and they try to intimidate other people, or they use disinformation, lies, to keep themselves in power or to amass wealth, personal wealth for themselves. Because for the most part, these people are psychopaths. You see, they have very serious problems or disorders that means that they should never have any kind of role in government of a nation, but yet they have taken over this power because that was the era in which Satan was ruling the world before the fulfillment of Our Lady's prophecies. Satan was in control only because God allowed him to be in control, as was revealed to Pope Leo XIII toward the end of the 19th century. So, or actually the beginning of the 20th century. So we see now that Leo XIII wrote one of the encyclicals that the church has come out with in defense of a just social order. It doesn't specify which system of economics is better, because that isn't the expertise or the role that the church plays as far as teachings are concerned. It doesn't have to do with observable kinds of phenomena which are studied by scientists, but rather general truths which pervade and are applicable to all times for all people. So it has always been in agreement with the best philosophical ideas of Greece and Rome and the Western tradition, because those ideas reflected truth about human beings, which is the natural law. So here we are today now, and where we're going from here is that all of these negative forces have to be rejected, and we have to form a society on different principles. So this is all going to happen, and no one really expected the complete uh, overthrow from within of Soviet Russia, because the ideology behind it was that the government would make all decisions under a socialistic uh, structure for the to decide what each person was allowed to enjoy, which is contrary to the truth the natural law. You see, individuals have a right to what they produce, to own goods according to how much they produce, and this is a permanent kind of an ownership. It's not just for a limited time or when the government says it's okay, but there's also a dimension where the goods themselves uh, or the benefits have to be extended for the common good of all. In other words, a person can't just do anything they want with what they have, what they own, to the detriment of others, to the detriment of our common home, the earth, and the ecology that we have. So we have to now use that model of Russia, now that Russia is in the process of conversion. As this goes on, uh, mutati mutandi, the United States has taken on this role uh, to in the ideology which rejected Christ, the role of bringing this kind of a utopia, this false uh, promise of prosperity and happiness to the world. In other words, Russia had that role before under communism. Now, under this new distorted ideology, materialism, capitalism that we have today, this has been transferred over to the United States. So just as Russia was brought down by truth and the power of Christian beliefs, now we are entering that era of peace. So the same has to occur here, especially in the United States. In other words, this evil power structure has to be completely done away with here in the United States. It's not going to be an easy job to do, but in any event, the good thing about it is this: if it's an era of peace, that means that although throughout history these problems have been resolved by people taking up arms and fighting each other, nations against nations. Now we've gone beyond that, so we will see these problems resolved through a process which will not involve that kind of violence in the form of nuclear war or some other type of a terrible kind of destruction occurring, as we saw in our own country on September 11th, 2001, both in Washington, D.C. and in New York City, where thousands of our citizens and others were tragically murdered just to create a situation which would bring our nation into an unjust war in Iraq, and so the war in Afghanistan, which to this day has not yet reached an end. So that's what we're looking forward to in the future. That's where we're going. And so please stick with what Our Lady is asking us to do, where she says about her son, do whatever he tells you to do.